March 1945, a forward command post near Koblenz, Germany. The air smells of damp pine needles and diesel exhaust. Inside a canvas tent, a man in a rumpled wool coat stands before a desk. He is not wearing a helmet. He does not carry a rifle. He holds a charcoal sketch of a village square and a pair of scratched binoculars. He speaks with a desperate urgency, pointing to a cluster of stone houses 3 miles to the east. Across from him, a career officer sits with his back straight and his boots polished to a mirror shine. The officer does not look at the sketch. He does not look at the man. He looks at a sign on his desk that equates intelligence with trained analysis. This is the moment pride became a death sentence. General George S. Patton is about to show this officer that a civilian with eyes is worth more than a colonel with a closed mind. This is the story of how an intelligence officer's refusal to listen to a civilian cost the lives of 9 brave tank crewmen and sparked a legendary confrontation with a general who valued truth over rank. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities. By following our channel, you ensure these moments of history are never forgotten. Edward Callahan was 34 years old and hailed from the brick-lined streets of Boston. Before the war, he had been a crime reporter, a man who learned to read the truth in the sweat on a suspect's brow and the inconsistencies in a police report. He had traded his city desk for an Associated Press press pass and a heavy wool coat 18 months ago. Since then, he had seen more of the jagged front line than many of the staff officers back at headquarters. He had survived the mud of Italy and the hedgerows of Normandy, losing a fingertip to a mortar fragment outside St. Lo. That loss was a constant reminder that in war, a second of hesitation or a single missed detail could be fatal. He wasn't a soldier, but he had the eyes of a scout and the scars to prove he didn't scare easily. He stood in the command post not to win a Pulitzer, but to keep the boys he'd shared sea rations with from driving into a meat grinder. Major Conrad Bishop was 37 and represented the polished elite of Grosse Pointe, Michigan. He had spent his pre-war years in the quiet halls of academia, and that sense of intellectual superiority followed him into the olive drab of the regimental S2 office. To Bishop, intelligence was a science reserved for those with the proper credentials and the correct stamps on their paperwork. He wore a uniform that looked as though it had never seen the underside of a Jeep, and he kept his workspace as organized as a library shelf. He had a fundamental disdain for anyone who operated outside the official chain of command, often remarking that the fog of war was mostly created by the imaginations of the untrained. On his desk sat a small, framed sign that served as his personal creed. Intelligence equals trained analysis, not anecdotes. For Bishop, the world was a map to be studied, not a place to be felt or seen by those he deemed beneath his station. By March 1945, the Third Army was tearing through the heart of the Rhineland. The German resistance was a flickering candle, but the dying light was often the most dangerous. The Wehrmacht was no longer a cohesive wall of steel. It had become a collection of jagged, desperate shards. Pockets of elite armor, like the Tiger Companies, were being shifted under the cover of night and fog to ambush the overextended American columns. The front lines were fluid and chaotic. A village that was empty at breakfast could be a fortress by noon. This was the environment where traditional intelligence often failed. The speed of the Allied advance outpaced the formal reporting of the rear echelon analysts. In the scramble for the Rhine, many senior officers had begun to rely on a loose network of unconventional sources. They listened to French partisans, German deserters, and even the frantic warnings of local farmers. Most commanders understood that a man with a pair of binoculars on a ridge was worth 10 radio intercepts from 3 days ago. But Major Bishop belonged to a different school of thought. He represented a cadre of officers who believed that the chaos of the battlefield could be tamed by rigid adherence to protocol. They had spent years in training being told that only military scouts were qualified to identify enemy movements. To them, accepting a civilian's report was a breach of professional standards. It was a symptom of a breakdown in discipline. While other units were adapting to the frantic pace of the German retreat, the S2 at this command post remained anchored to a desk and a philosophy of exclusion. They had ignored small reports before, dismissing civilian sightings of snipers or minefields as mere hysteria. They believed they were maintaining the purity of their data. In reality, They were building a wall between themselves and the truth on the ground. That wall was about to collapse as the morning sun hit the stone houses of a village 3 miles away. Callahan leaned over the map table, his hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the morning. "Major, I am telling you, I watched them through the glass for 20 minutes, 6 tigers. They moved into the village square and the orchards on the western edge. They are dug in and waiting." Major Bishop did not look up from the report he was signing. He reached for a blotter, tapped it twice on the paper, and then finally raised his eyes. "Mr. Callahan, your enthusiasm for the war effort is noted, but you are a journalist. You see a boxy silhouette and your mind jumps to the most dramatic conclusion. It is a common civilian error." Callahan slammed his hand onto the table. "I know a tiger from a Panzer IV. I know the sound of a Maybach engine. I was 300 yards away on the ridge. I even drew you the positions. Look at the sketch." Bishop leaned back, his chair creaking in the quiet tent. "I have actual reconnaissance patrols out, Mr. Callahan. Trained soldiers who know how to report distance, bearing, and tank variants without the flair of a Boston Sunday column. I don't accept tactical intelligence from reporters. You are a civilian. Report your stories, Ed. Route about the heroic faces of the boys from Kansas. Leave the fantasies of armored movements to the men who wear a uniform." Callahan's voice dropped to a low, hard rasp. "If you send that Sherman platoon in there without checking my ridge, you are sending them into a graveyard." Bishop's face flushed a deep, angry red. "You are overstepping. Protocol requires that I base my tactical decisions on verified military intelligence. I will not divert a scout team to chase a ghost cited by a man who doesn't know a squad from a section. Get out of my command post before I have the MPs escort you to the press pool in the rear." Callahan didn't move for a long second, staring into the eyes of a man who valued a manual more than a life. He turned and walked out, finding a captain named Miller outside the tent. "Captain, the S2 is blind. There are tigers in that village." Miller looked at the tent, then back at the reporter's frantic eyes. "If the major says it's clear, I have to move my men. I'm sorry, Ed." 3 hours later, the radio in the command post erupted into a cacophony of screams and static. The Sherman platoon had reached the village. The first tank was hit before it cleared the first hedgerow. The second was a torch 10 seconds later. 9 men did not come home. The report of the disaster, and the ignored warning that preceded it, reached Patton within the hour. The roar of a multi-bank engine cut through the heavy silence of the command post. A dust-covered jeep skidded to a halt, and before the wheels stopped turning, the 4 stars on the helmet were visible. Patton did not wait for the door to be opened. He stepped out, his ivory-handled revolvers catching the dim light of the tent, and walked straight past the sentries. The room went silent. Major Bishop snapped to attention, his face pale, his hand trembling as it touched his brow. Patton did not return the salute. He walked to the desk, his eyes fixed on the sign about trained analysis. He didn't raise his voice, but the coldness in his tone made the officers in the back of the room step away from the walls. "Major, I have a report here that says you were warned. Is that correct?" Bishop swallowed hard, his throat dry. "General, the source was unverified. It was a civilian correspondent." Patton stepped closer, his shadow falling across the map table. "Did this civilian tell you there were tigers in that village 3 hours before my boys were burned alive in their seats?" Bishop nodded slowly. "He did, sir, but protocol states that tactical intelligence must come from." Patton cut him off. "Did he offer to guide your scouts to the ridge?" Bishop looked down at his boots. "He did, General, but I had no reason to trust a reporter over my own analysis." Patton stared at him for a long, agonizing minute. "You think that uniform makes you smarter than a man who uses his eyes. You sat in this tent with a clean collar, while a man who has crawled through the mud of 3 campaigns told you exactly where the enemy was hiding. You chose to worship a manual instead of looking at a map. You didn't just ignore a reporter. You ignored the reality of the battlefield because it didn't have the right paperwork attached to it. Those 9 men didn't die because of German steel. They died because of your vanity. You wanted to be the smartest man in the room, and now you're the most useless. You have a choice, Major. You can either pick up a rifle and go fill the spot of one of those tank commanders you sent to their deaths, or you can face a court-martial for criminal negligence. Actually, I'll make it simpler for you. You are relieved of your duties effective immediately. You are going to spend the rest of this war doing exactly what you think is beneath you. Since you don't value the eyes of a civilian, you will provide the labor that keeps them safe. Pack your gear. You're headed to the rear to dig graves for the men who paid for your protocol. Bishop stood frozen, his eyes wide, as Patton turned his back on him and walked toward the man in the rumpled wool coat. The punishment was executed in the cold mud of the regimental cemetery at dawn. Major Bishop did not wear his polished brass or his starched service coat. On Patton's orders, he was stripped of his rank insignia and handed a rusted spade. He stood between the fresh, rectangular wounds in the earth, the graves meant for the very men he had dismissed as a fantasy. The air was thick with the smell of wet clay and the distant rumble of artillery, but the only sound nearby was the rhythmic, metallic scrape of the shovel hitting the stony ground. A detail of battle-weary infantrymen stood watch, their eyes hard and unforgiving as they watched the man from Grosse Pointe struggle with the weight of the dirt. Each shovelful was a penance. Every time he stopped to catch his breath, he was met with the silent, accusing stares of the men who had lived through the ambush he said was impossible. The news of the demotion spread through the camp like wildfire, a visceral reminder that in the Third Army, the life of a soldier was worth more than the pride of an officer. By noon, the graves were ready, and as the chaplain spoke the final words over the 9 draped coffins, the man who had once worshipped protocol was forced to stand at the edge of the pit, his hands blistered and his face caked in the dust of the men he had failed. Edward Callahan returned to Boston shortly after the war ended in 1945. He never wrote a book about his experiences, but he kept the charcoal sketch of the Tiger tank positions framed in his study for 40 years. He returned to the city desk, but spent much of his time advocating for the safety of field correspondents, ensuring they were treated as more than just observers. He lived a quiet, dignified life until his passing in 1982. The 9 families of the tankers killed near Koblenz never knew his name, but he never forgot theirs, keeping a list of the men tucked inside his old wartime journal. Conrad Bishop survived the war, though he never regained his rank or his reputation after his time in the labor details. He was discharged in late 1945 and returned to Grosse Pointe. He attempted to return to academia, but his military record followed him, and he found the doors of the elite institutions closed. He lived out his remaining years in a state of quiet bitterness, often writing letters to military journals arguing for the purity of intelligence protocols. He died in 1971, largely forgotten by the men he had served with, a victim of his own refusal to see the world beyond his desk. General Patton mentioned the incident only once in a letter to his wife, Beatrice. He wrote that the greatest sin an officer can commit is the sin of arrogance. He believed that the truth was a weapon, and anyone who refused to pick it up was a traitor to the men under his command. He often said that he didn't care if a report came from a general or a beggar, so long as the man had used his eyes to see what was real. For Patton, the lesson was simple. A map is only a piece of paper, but the dirt beneath a soldier's feet is the truth. Some historians argue that General Patton's decision was an impulsive overreach that bypassed the standard military justice system and humiliated a career officer for a common error of caution. They point out that in the fog of war, civilian reports are frequently inaccurate, and that Major Bishop was simply following the training provided by the Army's own intelligence schools. Others argue that the incident was a necessary correction for a systemic failure of imagination and a dangerous culture of elitism within the staff corps. They maintain that the loss of life was entirely preventable, and that Patton's mirrored punishment served as a vital lesson in accountability for the entire Third Army. What is certain is that after this confrontation, the protocol for evaluating field intelligence was permanently altered to include any credible source with eyes on the target. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply issued a formal reprimand? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more stories about the truth behind the myths of military glory, make sure to subscribe.